go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the King's Highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory. So Moses is asking permission for the children of Israel to pass through the King's Highway, to go through the land of Edom, and they don't want to let them do that. Edom and Moab won't allow them to do it. And so they have to go around. Now, I look at that and think, that's the easy way? What would the hard way be, right? Man, but it's the easy way because there's water sources along the edge of it, right? And so the children of Israel had to go way out to the desert and go around that way because they couldn't pass on the King's Highway. Well, when you come into Petra, this is Ain Musa. This was back in 1986, and so we stopped and we checked out this because they call it Ain Spring, Musa, the spring of Moses, right? In the spring of Moses, people believe that this is where Moses struck the rock and the water poured out. I don't think so because they weren't able to really go through that area. But anyway, that's the local tradition. So the children of Israel had to go around. The Edomites wouldn't let them pass through their territory, so they had to go around through the desert. So probably is not really that accurate. However, it is kind of a nice thing to go and see people drinking from the water. I try not to drink from it, but anyway, people drinking from the water and filling their containers and so on. There's a hotelier there. Now, when we went in 1986, they had just really opened Petra. And so there were really no hotels. And so the guy there had a room, a little pension next door. And so he asked my wife, you want to look at a room? And so she said, sure. We went and looked at it. And the Turkish toilet, you know what a Turkish toilet is? It's just some porcelain with a hole in the ground, right? You know where the shower was? You stood in the toilet to take a shower. She said, I can't do this. I can't do it. So again, in those days, no hotels. By the way, that hotelier is still there. I saw him the other day and had a nice chat with him and kind of reminisced on that story from 1986. So we went in and we found the only other hotel at that time. Now there's hundreds of hotels there and hundreds of thousands of people visiting. This is at the entrance. It was the government rest house. Today it's operated by Holiday Inn and it's part of the Crown Plaza. And so they actually had some of their rooms in those days actually in some of the caves, which was pretty exciting. So we stayed there. Helen and I were up before sunrise. We wanted to catch the golden rays gracing the surrounding mountains. Now the region is a barren wilderness, as you can see, and we're zooming in on this peak, 3,500 feet, Mount Hor. Remember who was buried on Mount Hor? Aaron, the brother of Moses, that's right. So it's the traditional site of Moses' tomb. Can you see the little building up on the top? Yes. And so it's the traditional site of Mount Hor. We don't know if Aaron was actually buried there or not. What we do know is if you're down on the Araba, on the other side, as you're on that road, you can look up and you can see that shrine on the top of that hill. A summit named el-Birai by the Arabs can also be seen. It means mother of cisterns because of the great number of cisterns that were carved on top of that rock. Now, can you imagine? If you're on top of the rock, you've got food, you've got water. A few scores of people could keep off hundreds or thousands of enemy soldiers because they found out a long time ago it's easier to throw rocks down the hill than it is to throw rocks up the hill, right? Right. Okay. But it reminds us of what the Bible said about Mount Seir. You who live in the clefts of the rocks, who occupy the heights of the hill, though you build your nest as high as the eagles, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So here's a prophecy that the people on the heights of the hill of Mount Seir will be brought down. That's the house of Edom. Who was Edom, by the way? Remember who Edom was? Esau. The house of Esau, the brother of Jacob, the twin brother of Jacob. So while the view was splendid, we'd not come to see the view of the mountains. We'd come to visit the ruins of the Nabateans, and so we were very excited about that. Instead of going back into town and doubling back and taking the horses in, like these young guys in those days, they're now much older, I convinced my wife to scale down the cliffs. We were young and energetic, and so we scaled down the cliffs. They're about 300-foot perpendicular cliffs, and we left a lot of blood in the skin along the way, but it just added to the anticipation of seeing the wonders purported to be the most wonderful in all the world, right? Yes. Entrance into the city is guarded is only through a few rock gorges called wadis. That's a dry stream bed that only runs with the water when the rains come. And you can see how that the rains have worn through this canyon through the centuries and millenniums, allowing you to get into this inside. Now, it doesn't rain for months on end. During the summer dry season, it doesn't rain at all, but they get about 12 inches of rain in the winter. As you're wandering down the Wadi Musa, it's called the Wadi Musa because the spring would flow through there as well. It goes for about 1.5 miles or 8,000 feet. The Arabs called the gorge the Seek, which means cleft. Nowhere is it wider than 60 feet, and most of the time it's about 20 feet, or sometimes even narrower, and the perpendicular walls go up about 160 feet on each side. The light of the sun is nearly blocked out as you walk down the cool wadi. It is very special. Now, when I first went in, you can see here on the left, by the way, that's an aqueduct. Didn't even know there were aqueducts in those days because the debris was probably about 15 feet high, and now they've taken it all the way down to the level of the road, at least the Roman road, back at that period of time. So it can easily be seen, here you can see Petra down in the bottom, up on the hills, that you could actually, if there's only one or two entrances into this place, that a couple hundred people could hold thousands of enemies at bay because they had the height to protect it, and you can only get in through those gorges. Now, after many twists and turns through the beautiful sandstone mountains, you come to a narrow opening just 9 feet wide. I know of nothing to equal the sight that you're seeing right now as you come around that last turn and you see the rock-cut facade and how beautiful it is. The brilliance of the sunshine upon the rose-red rock is breathtaking, isn't it? And it changes all through the day, by the way. This is a morning shot. That's actually an evening shot. But it changes all through the day. And it is just spectacular. It's called El Kesna, which means the treasury. It was carved in the Greek style from the living rock. The 2 stories you can see have Corinthian columns. They're about 90 feet high. Now, what's protected this is because it's at a point secluded from the wind and the rain, so rain hasn't really worn it away, and it's a nice hard stone. And you can still see all the cuts and the lines of the architecture, very clear, although it has suffered badly from human hands. You can kind of see the little urn on the top. A story developed that maybe it was full of gold, so that only encouraged people to come and take pot shots at it with their rifles, and that's why it's a little bit disfigured there, as you can see on the very top. It may not have a great emphasis for the Bible, but for the lover of art and architecture, nothing more beautiful than this. It's called Pharaoh's Treasury, or El Khazna El Faroun, Pharaoh's Treasury. Now the room inside, let me just say this, there we go. The room inside is just a very interesting, let me back up. We talked a little bit about that movie. Which one was it? Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, when he's looking for the Holy Grail, right? And he comes here to this, and he goes into the door. Remember, there's a whole long room and all kind of obstacles and different things happening. It's just a room about the size of this platform. Just a closet, okay? Nothing really there. Now, in the old days, we could actually go into that room, and you can see that we were walking on this level here, and you just go into the room, and nothing there at all. More excavations have actually revealed that this was not a treasury or a tomb. It was a monument for a tomb that is right here. Can you see the little grating there? I want to try and give you a picture to look down. It's kind of hard to see. You look down, and that was King Aretas IV, who was the king of Damascus as well when Paul was locked in the city. And so he's buried here, and this is the monument for his tomb that we're seeing as we go in. We now know that archaeologically. When I first went there for many trips, we didn't know that. Now, I found this very interesting. David Roberts came in 1839, and he drew this picture. And if we were to try and compare this, you can see that the entrance into that is about 15, 20 feet above the current entrance, because through the centuries, all the debris, the sand, the dirt, the rocks have all washed down and collected down into there, and the elevation has risen. Here's another one. You can just kind of see how high that is. Well, here you can kind of see the horse here. Let's just go back. I'm curious now myself. So, you can see it's way up to there. So all that would be just totally covered and under the debris. Well, let's take a look back at the Seek one final time. As I said, just 9 feet as it opens up into the valley itself. It's called the Seek or the Cleft. And now we want to go on and wander down through the city. Over 1,000 buildings carved out of the rock, tombs, temples, dwellings, carved by the Nabateans. I earlier had said the Edomites, and they were replaced by the Arab Nabateans, descendants of Ishmael. And some of them are quite well preserved. Some of them are kind of eroded with time. As you can see here, this one's quite eroded and have not been preserved in such good condition. Some of this is harder rock over here and a little bit better as it's been preserved. Here's the urn tomb. This urn tomb is interesting because it actually became a 5th century Byzantine church. So there's some nice crosses in the back. You can see where they actually lived in there and had their church services as this became a Christian area. Here's the Corinthian tomb. It looks a lot like the treasury, doesn't it? But you see, it's softer rock and it's exposed to the wind and the weather, and so it's eroded with time, although it's probably just as beautiful as the treasury when it was originally built. Now, high above the city, we go up to a gigantic monument, not carved in the mountainside, but fashioned by removing the mountain itself. It's called Ed Deer, the monastery, because the church used it as a monastery. Isn't that beautiful? It's about 997 steps, by the way, to get up to that. And you can see that beautiful urn on the top. Isn't that lovely? It's just cut with the most wonderful detail. The door is about 30 feet high, as if it was to be used by a race of giants. And well worth the hike to get up to the top of this. As you can see how tall the door is and look at the person standing there, right? Now, in the old days, the brave or the foolish, and I was in the foolish category, could actually go up and you could stand on the top of that and it would give you a fabulous view of the Araba. So we're going to look all the way across the Araba and over to modern Israel on that mountain on the other side. A couple of years ago, my wife and I had a group of pastors from Virginia, and we were up there. We were enjoying all of that, and as we were leaving, what happened? A flash flood. And so all the locals are running, run for your life, run for your life. And my wife said, we got to run. I said, no. It only gets deeper when you go down. Let's stay where we're at. We'll go up. And so we sheltered in place against my wife's, I'm picking on my wife since she's here, against my wife's better judgment. And I thought we can always go up, but you can't go down. Quite an exciting thing because a number of years ago, there were about 21 British tourists who were killed in a flash flood. Now today they've actually diverted the water so it doesn't go down through the valley in the major way anymore, and we shouldn't have an accident like that happen again. But it was still quite exciting and got your blood pressure going. Look at these temples carved out of solid rock. Isn't that beautiful? Just the different minerals and so on that were laid down here. It is just spectacular to see these beautiful colors. Look at that. Look at the veins. There's like a fairyland of red and purple and blue interwoven together, and just spectacular. They also had a very lovely, the Romans took over this area, and it was given to them so they didn't have to have a battle. It was passed on after the death of a king. And so here's a Roman amphitheater. It seats about 2,500 people, perfect acoustics. You don't need a microphone. Very, very good. But up beside that is a stairway that takes you up to the high place. And so here you can just kind of see, we're going to enjoy looking as we go up to the Acropolis of the city, where they actually had sacrifices. And so this is also a very exciting place to hike up. You can see a person hiking there, and it gives you a fabulous view when you get up to the top. And here we can see the altar. And so this altar is very interesting because we know animal sacrifices were there, and there's some debate, but it appears as though there were human sacrifices as well. So the blood would actually drop down through that and go out through the channel. And there was also a very interesting triclinium table up there on the top. So Petra was a fabulous place, protected, well-watered, and yet it was deserted and forgotten for 1,000 years. What happened? It became a legendary city known only from stories of the past, and people didn't know were the stories true, or is it like Atlantis, and just kind of loosely based on some ideas, What's the deal with it? No one really knew. How much of the description had to be discounted of the city? No one could say, until a young Swiss explorer, John Ludwig Burckhardt, came to the area. Now, he was traveling through the Middle East for the British Society, and he dressed himself as an Arab. He learned Arabic. And as he traveled through, he began hearing stories. He was traveling from Damascus to Cairo, very treacherous in those days, by the way. So as he's traveling along, he begins hearing these stories about some extraordinary ruins in Wadi Musa. And so he said, well, I need to kind of check this out in his diary. Kind of cool, right? That's what his diary says. The road from Shobak to Aqaba, Shobak, by the way, is where one of the big Crusader castles was, right? Is tolerably good. It lies to the east of Wadi Musa, and to have quitted it out of mere curiosity to see the wadi would have looked suspicious in the eyes of the Arabs. I therefore pretended to have made a vow to have slaughtered a goat in honor of Aaron, whose tomb I knew was situated at the extremity of the valley, and by this strategy I thought I should see. Remember we saw Mount Hor? He said, well, I got to sacrifice a goat to Aaron while I'm here, right? That's his excuse to get in there. To have quitted it out of the means of seeing the valley on the way to the tomb. To this my guide had nothing to oppose. The dread of drawing on himself by resistance the wrath of Aaron completely silenced him. So he got his plan. He gets to Elgi, the little village there. He hires this guy as a guide. He gets his goat. He gets his water skin. And they start going in. Can you imagine? He sees the tomb in the distance. He says, I got to get closer. And as they start going through, the first Westerner for 1,000 years to see these sights. Can you imagine? Isn't that exciting? Wow. And so as he comes in, he starts being overwhelmed by what he's seeing. Can you imagine when he comes through the sea and sees this? Somehow he goes over and he sketches it, gets a plan of it in his journal. Kind of exciting. And then he has to go on. He gets the urn tomb and the Corinthian tomb. And then the guy says, you're just a treasure hunter. And pulls up his rifle and he says, oh, no. So they go on to sunset. They sacrifice the goat to Aaron, and they turn around and go out. And this is what he writes in his journal. It appears very probable, isn't that interesting? Very probable that the ruins of Wadi Musa are those of ancient Petra, and it is remarkable that Eusebius, an early church father of the 4th century, says that the tomb of Aaron was shown near Petra. How exciting, huh? Isn't that interesting? So the question is this: how could such a fantastic city as this, hidden in the mountains, all of this water and food, how could it be lost for 1,000 years? Well, let's look on the map. Here we can kind of see the old trade routes, the Arabian trade route, the way of Shur, the way of the sea, the spice trade route. So what would happen is the trade, very expensive trade, frankincense and myrrh, more expensive than gold, would be coming up from Yemen here on this trail. And they come up where they'd sail up to the Gulf of Aqaba to Ezion Gabor. And then they come up, and Petra was right there on the way that would go to the little route, the spice route going over to Gaza so they could ship it out. So it's on the main highway. See that? The King's Highway is going on there. You can see that. We talked about the King's Highway a moment ago. So Petra was very, very strategically located. As I said at first, it was settled by the Edomites. Children of Esau, they were overrun by the Arab Nabateans. Now, the Nabateans made this a very rich city because of their camels. Any idea how many camels in a caravan? Take a guess. 12? 1,000? They say 1,000, and sometimes it'd be 10 caravans connected together. Now, can you imagine pulling into the filling station with 10,000 camels? You had to have a pretty major operation. By the way, Herod the Great in the story of Jesus in Bethlehem, his father Antipater, that's how he made all of his money. He managed that trade route from Petra to Gaza, and he made all of his money doing that. That's how he got his wealth. So, Petra was very, very wealthy. Their territory stretched from Aqaba there on the Gulf of Aqaba to Damascus. They controlled that desert road, and at first they were raiding the people coming by, and then they thought, why should we raid them? Why don't we just charge a toll? And so they became extremely wealthy, and that's how they could build all of this. Here's some of the spices, the frankincense. Isn't that beautiful? Again, multiple times the cost of gold. So they raided them, but then they started charging. The taxes and services made them a very, very wealthy people, and enabling them to embellish their capital with the wonders we've seen tonight. Now, the problem is, that's myrrh here in the little thing over here, in the little spoon. So all these things are coming up because life was tough and it didn't smell good and so on, so they wanted this all over. What happened is the trade routes around Africa opened up. So you didn't need to do a camel caravan anymore. You didn't need to come from down by the Indian Ocean and Yemen all the way up, or if you even sail up the Red Sea and so on. And so as the trade routes began to open up, the sea lanes were opened up around Africa. The territory dried up and Petra was deserted and forgotten until the inquiry of the archaeologists discovered it again. But here's what the text says in Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau. The Lord has spoken. And so we see the prophets predicting the downfall, and we see that history reveals an unusual fulfillment. It disappeared for over 1,000 years. Now, by the way, I talked about Herod. Herod's father was an Edomite. His mother was a princess from Petra. So he was not really Jewish, but his father was forced to become a Jew during a certain period under someone named John Hyrcanus. And so that many Jewish people said that didn't count because you're forced to do this or lose your land, so you're not really Jewish. That's part of the rub between Herod and the Jewish people. So tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about archaeology and how the archaeologists quietly are working to uncover these tombs and cities. It's not geology, the study of the rocks, or anthropology, the study of the development of man. It's a science that looks back to try and understand the artifacts and remains of humans. Biblical archaeology, which is what I'm interested in, lets us look at the culture and the life and try and get that color of Bible times and Bible lands. Now, when we think about the Holy Land, the attraction became very big in the time of Helena. Do you remember who Helena was? The mother of Constantine. So Helena becomes a Christian, and she wants to go and look at these places. So she goes to the Bible lands, and she looks for the several places to build churches. And so she builds 4 churches in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Very, very interesting. And this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you can see here is a Greek priest. You can see there's someone not Greek there kneeling beside him. What kind of hat does that guy have on? You see? You see him? My pointer doesn't do it. You see the point? He's Armenian. That's Mount Ararat, the first Christian nation. So this church is actually maintained by 7 Christian denominations. The Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church came during the Crusades. The Armenians have been there from the early centuries. The Egyptian Coptic Church has been there since 325. Impressive. And then, of course, the Ethiopians are there as well as the Syrian Orthodox Church. Okay? And so she came and she built this church. She built a church in Bethlehem over the church of the tomb. Over the cave where it was believed that Jesus was born. And she built a church up on the Mount of Olives to commemorate the sermon of Jesus, a tremendous prophecy, which Tyler will be probably talking to you about in the Gospel of Matthew. This is the stone of unction. It's kind of changed hands between the period when the Orthodox were in charge and the Roman Catholics were in charge and back and forth, but they believe that Jesus was laid out here and prepared for his burial in this place. So people in these days thought you could go there and get salvation by going to the Holy Land. Makes sense, right? But then things kind of faded as Islam came and it became kind of more difficult to get there and so on. But then during the Reformation, people began reading their Bibles. They started wondering, I wonder what the Sea of Galilee was really, I wonder what the Jordan River was like. I wonder what the Sea of Galilee was like. They began wondering about these places, so they started going to try and get an understanding of the land. Now, I've got a favorite scholar in Jerusalem. His name is Bargel Pixner. He wrote a fabulous line. He said, there are 5 Gospels that tell the story of Jesus. 4 you'll find in books, and 1 you'll find in the land they call holy. Understand the fifth gospel, and the world of the four gospels will open before you. Isn't that beautiful? I plagiarize it all the time. I actually have something we're pitching to History Channel called Mysteries of the Fifth Gospel, exposing the real Jesus. Anyway, soon after that, the Renaissance comes along and people start going there to look for museum pieces. And so they're actually trying to find things, pilfer things to put into their museums. And so we have much of this going on. And then something very happens. We talked about it last night. Napoleon invades Egypt in the late 1790s. And then they found the Rosetta Stone, as we said, and all of a sudden the whole world of Egypt opens up, and there's this huge interest in the Bible lands. So Edward Robinson comes in 1850, and he's standing here at the Spring of Jericho. And he's saying, I'm here at the Spring of Jericho. I know this is the Spring of Jericho, but I have no idea where the ancient city was. I want to just show you a picture here. That's the city, and if I could just put it right here, about right here is the Spring of Jericho. He's standing right next to it, but he has no idea that it's underneath the hill. Interesting. In 1860, this tomb was excavated on the Mount of Olives. But they were just kind of looking for artifacts and things they can put in the museums, and just kind of tore a lot of it up because it actually buried people in tombs. And we'll talk a little bit about that as the week goes on. These are called ossuaries or ossuaries. Sir William Flinders Petrie went down, and he was surveying the pyramids because he thought he could predict the future by what they told him. Well, we hear a lot about that, don't we? While he was there, he kind of lost faith in the Bible. His parents had been missionaries, and he lost faith and confidence in all that, but he became enamored with all this pottery being found. Now, this painted pottery from Greece had been organized for a long time into chronological periods, and he began to wonder, could we somehow organize this unpainted pottery turning up in Palestine into a chronological period? And so he began to do that. In 1890, he went to Tel Hesse and began to dig there on the Mediterranean coast near Ashkelon. And as he was digging, he experienced one of the first excavations you see. Here's all this fill. Let me go back to that. Can you see in the fill, there's potsherds in there? Can you see little pieces of pottery? You can see rocks, because what would happen is somebody would come by, a king, and he'd knock your city down. And then the people would come back because it was a pretty good place to live, and they'd scrape it, fill in all the depressions, right, and build another city. And then maybe a famine would come through, or a plague would come through, and you'd all die, but they'd come back, and you see what's going on? And they'd build on top of the other. And so he started seeing this, and this is like the first archaeological dig that we have going on in 1890. And here we can kind of see, as they were digging, they started finding these pieces of potsherds I was telling you about. This is a very interesting quote from a book I had read a number of years ago. The humble potsherd, the rubbish on the ground of any excavated site, was elevated to become the major implement in the archaeologist's hand in his attempts to pry open the vault of time. So they began finding those pieces, and that's how they began doing it. So here are the two big principles of archaeology: sequence dating and stratigraphy. Sequence dating means that those lamps I've shown you over here, and I said they were early Bronze Age, they're totally different than the ones down here that are early Christian, right? We can see. So when you find one of those lamps in a certain area, you know, well, that's from that period of time, right? And then stratigraphy. Stratigraphy means down here they lived, and then the next group lived here, and here, and here, and here, and here, like a layers on a cake. Pierre Vincent comes along, and he becomes an expert in pottery typology, and he begins to organize these things. So here we can kind of see some of the lamps going right down, and the changing of features going right down through time, as I've shown you on the table. Now, sometimes we find potsherds that actually have writing on them, right? They're called ostraca or ostracon, plural. Now, for my friend from Greece, when they would have a trial and they're going to vote for guilty or not guilty, they'd give them a piece of pottery. They'd give him a piece of pottery and they would write on it. And if he was kicked out of the city, what would he be called? What do we call that? Ostracized. Because it's ostracan. So it comes from the word ostracon or ostraca, right? You'd be ostracized if you were guilty and thrown out of the city. Very interesting, huh? So here we can see some writing. This is some interesting writing. We'll talk about this tomorrow night as we talk about the fall of Jerusalem. So why was the site chosen? Well, let's think about this for a moment. Number one, you have to have a source of water. What are some sources of water, by the way? What's the best source of water, would you say? Rain, okay? But you got to store the rain in cisterns? Well. Jacob dug a well. That was pretty good. Spring is going to be really the best source, right? It's going to be kind of the purest source. Rivers. So all these places had to have a source of water. What else did they have to have? Defensive walls, because remember what we said? It's easier to throw rocks down than to throw rocks up. Third thing is they need to have arable soil around them because you want to be able to farm, make a living. And then one of the things you worry about, who are the neighbors and things like that, that's kind of important too, I suppose. Now, a few sites had all these qualities, and so they would always come back. This actually is Tel Bet Shan, or Scythopolis in later times, but it's called Tel Bet Shan. You can just kind of see that there's stratification as they're going up the hill. So how can you tell? Is it a tell or just a hill? Well, they're usually conical in shape. That makes sense. You can usually see visible building remains. So you see dressed stones as you're walking around, kind of protruding out of the surface. And you find these ancient traditions, usually in Arabic in my part of the world. You're going to have Arabic kind of tying into the ancient name of that. You can kind of often tie the names together. You get clues. And then potsherds. Those shards are found on the ground. They just kind of work their way up. Now, I lived in New England at one point, and I had a garden. And you know what I grew every year in my garden? Rocks. They just came up, and that's how they have all those beautiful fieldstone walls, right? Because you grow rocks. Well, here, pottery comes up every year. And so as you're walking around, you know that somebody was there before. So we want to look to find meaning from the sands of the past. So I like this little quote from Archeology and the Religion of Israel. There can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition. So let's kind of look at it. Here's a place called Nuzi. Nuzi is in modern Iraq. And they found some tablets that parallel the story of Abraham and Jacob and Esau. They found the rights of a barren woman. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow night. That strange story of Abraham and Hagar and Sarah goes back to some of these tablets. And then they found one about a guy who actually sold his birthright for 3 sheep. Kind of sounds like Esau selling his birthright for some lentils, right? So old stories, odd stories that we thought were just fables were affirmed. In 1986, I went to Syria to inspect the fabulous ruins of this place called Tel Mardik. Ebla, 150 acres. Any idea how big Jericho is? About 8 acres. Okay, most cities in the land of Canaan, which became Israel later on, maybe 10 acres, 12 acres, 150 acres. The royal palace was found, and then in September 1976, they found 1,000 tablets here in the king's palace. And so I wanted to go there. I went there back in 1986 to explore it and see it. And then something had happened. Here's the archaeologist writing back in 1981, Time magazine. My first impression was that I was looking at a sea of clay tablets. They had burned this city, and the whole library collapsed, and it just kind of petrified and hardened into rock, these tablets. There were 1,000 of them. Ultimately, over 20,000 tablets were discovered. Now, in 2350 BC, there were more than 30,000 people living within the city. Okay? Over 300,000 people living in the area. Now, most of the records that they had were actually trade records, but I want you to notice what they have trade records with. They had trade records with places called Hatzor. Joshua, remember? Deborah. Oh, yeah, Hatzor in the Bible. They had trade records with Lachish and with Megiddo and with Gaza. And then, interestingly enough, they had trade records with Salem, just as Jerusalem is called in the book of Genesis. So this is really early. Now we're going back around 2350. And then Professor Petinato, he was the linguist on the site. He stunned the world by saying there were bills of sale with Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, that wasn't too popular. It was very controversial. Very controversial. Professor Mathia, who was excavating the site, said, no, he didn't find that. That's not true. They also found, he said, Abraham, Ishmael, Israel, Esau, Eber. Controversy. Around the year 2000, I had a group of pastors from Southern California, and we were touring through Greece, Turkey, and Syria. And I told my young guide, I said, we want to go to Tel Mardik. He said, you don't want to go to Tel Mardik. So we want to go to Tel Mardik. Yeah. Finally, we got away from the minder, who was the bus driver, and we got away from the minder, because they still had the secret prisons in those days. The daddy Assad was in power. So we get away, and I said, what in the world's the deal with this Tel Mardik? He says, you don't go there. I said, why? It goes back to this story. They were terrified that Israel was going to use this as a basis to invade and occupy Syria like they had the West Bank. Very serious. And so Professor Mathia said, no, that doesn't have any of that. He kept his license to excavate in Syria. You know what happened to Pedanato? He lost his license to excavate in Syria. So politics overruled the science of the archaeology. Anyway, Albright was considered the father of archaeology, and he saw more and more data coming in. He wrote this in 1936. He says, Genesis 14 used to be considered as unhistorical. Now we're more modest. He rewrote this in 1955 to say, Genesis 14 can no longer be considered unhistorical in view of the many confirmations of the details that we owe to recent finds. Think of what he would have said if he lived to see what happened at Ebla, right? He goes on to say, the narratives of Genesis dealing with Abraham may now be integrated into the life and history of the time in such surprisingly consistent ways, there can be little doubt about their substantial historicity. Just think if you'd have seen Ebla, right? Well, in 1834, John Texier was looking for Tavium, a lost Roman city of Tavium, and he's in central Turkey. He's out from modern Ankara, and he stumbles into this place called Bozakali, and he stumbles into this place, and look what he comes upon. He comes upon a huge city, bigger than the city of Athens at the height of its glory. Miles and miles of walls in length, larger than Athens. Problem was, there was no such big city missing. Interesting, as he tours around and looks around, he starts to find this, and he wondered, are these gods? Or what is this? And then he found these interesting soldiers, maybe, gods guarding the gates, these lions guarding other gates. What could this be? And then a native showed him took him to this place called Yazilikaya. And as he goes out there, it's actually their holy place. And he took him in and he showed him all these inner sanctums with all these carvings. Can you see the gods marching there? I think there's 12 gods just kind of lined up marching. And what was all this? And then they found writing. Looked like hieroglyphs, but it wasn't hieroglyphs. Totally a different language, but what language was missing? They didn't know. It was actually an embarrassment because they were finding more than was known to be lost. Turns out that all through, this is Turkey over here, this is called Anatolia in the old days, all through Anatolia, all the way over to Greece and down into Syria, they found this writing. Who could it be? Well, in 1880, Archibald Henry Sayce proposed this was the Hittites. The Bible mentions the Hittites 48 times. One time it actually says the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians. So people should have looked for that. The problem was there was not one word about the Hittites in any of the Greek or Roman literature. So they figured they must just be a Jewish fable because there's no record of them anywhere in the real chronologies of things, right? So it just must be made up, just a Jewish fable. Then as we talked about, the Rosetta Stone was found. And once the Rosetta Stone opened up, they began to read about Karnak. Oh, I went too quick. Sorry about that. There we go. Got to go back to Karnak. So in Karnak, there's all these stories about Ramses the Great, and he's involved in a battle with the Hittites. Interesting. But they never existed because they weren't in the Greek or Roman literature. In 1906, Winkler found this is the first international peace treaty in the history of our world between Ramses the Great and the king of the Hittites. And yet, when you would go down to Karnak, you'd read all this shameless propaganda that was believed for centuries and centuries, and they could read it about how he had actually defeated them. He called himself the Fearless One. He said, I put an end to the boastfulness of Haiti. He says, I'm the son of Ra, and I trampled the land of Haiti underfoot. You know, he was really just full of shameless propaganda. Nothing new, right? Under the sun. Anyway, this was believed for over 3,000 years until they found the real story. The real story is he got tricked. He went up to have this battle at a place called Kadesh up in Syria, and as he's going up there, he gets taken in by deception. They say, you know, the king heard you were coming with your armies, and he took off and went home. Well, if you're susceptible to flattery, what do? You march right in, right? He marches right in, and they get into a battle. He loses most of his army and most of his equipment and goes back home and makes the first international peace treaty and marries the king's daughter to try and seal the relationship. So the Hittites destroyed Ebla in 1600 BC, and they came to an end 69 years after the peace treaty with Ramses in 1200 BC. So the archaeologist Spade has opened up the remote past, confirming the biblical account of history by these clay tablets and these stone cylinders and manuscripts. And it's telling us over and over one thing, that the Bible again and again is being affirmed to be a reliable document. Let me tell you two more quick stories. Another mystery is the absence of the name Belshazzar. Does that ring a bell? Tyler was talking about Daniel a little bit, and Daniel being history, and Belshazzar. The problem was, there's no record of Belshazzar in Greek or Roman literature. So they said Belshazzar is just a Jewish myth, like the rest of the book of Daniel. And by the way, this is a glazed tile from the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. And I think Tyler will be excited to tell you one day about a lion with some eagle's wings, right? Because you read about that in Daniel 7, and there it is, right in the Ishtar Gate. How cool is that? Not a record of this. So they said, obviously just a Jewish fable. Why? Because there's tremendous prophecies in Daniel. And they did not want to admit that they were really prophecies. They just say they're just kind of written as prophecies, but they're really just stories written after the fact. Well, they knew that the ruler of Babylon when it fell, according to Greek and Roman literature, was Nabonidus. And in 1861, they found this cylinder, and it had a prayer of Nabonidus for his oldest son, Belshazzar. But it didn't call him king. So they said, well, it's not true. In 1882, they published the Nabonidus Chronicle, and we know he's the king at that time during the capture of Babylon, and it says that Nabonidus had left Babylon and was in Arabia at Tema, worshiping the moon god. And then in 1924, the verse account of Nabonidus by Smith was published, and it says he entrusted the kingship to his oldest son. Now, you might remember when you read in Daniel that it talks about you'll become the third ruler in the empire. So the Bible was proven to be true here, even though there was no record in Roman and Greek literature. Fascinating. Now here, I like this quote. This is actually from R.H. Pfeiffer of Harvard University. I hate to pick on him. But he says he doesn't believe that Daniel's true, because if you believe Daniel's true and really written back at that time, then you got a problem, because there's these prophecies that might have to also be true, right? He says, quote, we shall presumably never know how our author learned that Belshazzar, mentioned only in the Babylonian records, in Daniel and in Baruch 1:1, which is based on Daniel, was functioning as king when Cyrus took Babylon. Interesting. But we know it can't be, because if that's true, then these prophecies must be true too, because it must have been written back at that time. You see this dilemma? Fascinating, isn't it? Again, the Bible has been vindicated. It's historically accurate. I like this little quote. It says, of all the non-Babylonian records dealing with the situation at the close of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the 5th chapter of Daniel ranks next to cuneiform literature in accuracy so far as outstanding events are concerned. Again, we see the Bible is true, but people wonder, as did Frederick Kenyon in 1939, he wrote, how well are we provided with manuscripts of the Hebrew Old Testament? It's generally rather a shock when one first learns that the oldest existent manuscripts are no earlier than the 9th century after Christ. You get what he's saying? You really trust that Bible? You really trust that Old Testament, as we call it? I call it the Hebrew Scriptures. Do you really trust those Hebrew Scriptures? Do you realize there's over 1,000 years from the earliest manuscript we have until when they actually wrote them? Can you imagine? He said, well, let's just see what he says. He goes on. Over 1,000 years separate our earliest Hebrew manuscripts from the date at which the latest of the books contained in them was originally written. It's a disquieting thought when one reflects how much a text may be corrupted or mutilated in the course of transmission by manuscript over a long period of time. He's saying, you can't trust this. 1,000 years. I mean, can you imagine how many errors and things that might have been? What year was it when he wrote that? 1939. Because 8 years later, down by the Dead Sea, something very unusual happened, remember? The traditional story is Muhammad Abdib was looking for his lost goat. He was a shepherd boy with his cousin. And they came along and they thought the goat might be up in that cave, and they threw a rock into there and they expected to hear bah, bah, and they heard pottery breaking, and they were so frightened they ran away and went back home into their tent and slept in the tent. And they couldn't sleep, the traditional story says, because they thought maybe it's a genie, as somebody was saying. Arabs believe in genies. Maybe it's a genie, or maybe it's gold. So they went back, the traditional story says, and they climbed up and they went into that. And can you imagine how disappointed they were? They found all these old pottery containers there in the cave and some old pieces of leather rolled up. They were so disappointed. They took it home, stretched it out, and it went from one end of their tent to the other. That's the traditional story. Of course, this becomes the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the traditional story is that Muhammad Abdib and his cousin took this across the desert. It's about 8 miles from that spot across the desert to Bethlehem to a shoe cobbler named Kando. And Kando bought them, and the traditional story is he bought them and thought, well, at least I can use them for mending shoes, if nothing else, right? That's the traditional story. This is Kando's grandson, Shipley, a good friend of mine. And Kando received, by the way, ultimately a grant from the Israeli government to be an antiquities dealer. So many of these pieces on my table are from their shop, to be honest. And I like to go here because you see this jar? That's one of the original 4 jars. 2 are in the Israel Museum in the Shrine of the Book. If you go there, you can't take any pictures. And one's in the Vatican, and one is here in Kando's shop. So I like to go and let people actually go where you can get a picture of one of those 4 jars in that cave 4 that they found. And he tells a story. He says, in America, you have cowboys. Are they children? Muhammad Abdib was not a child. They were shepherd boys. My grandfather was paying them to look for antiquities that he could sell on the antiquities market. That's how all this was found, and they created this story to cover up what had actually happened. Shipley and his grandfather happened to be Syrian Orthodox Christians, meaning that they read Aramaic. And one of the first pieces found turned out to be, Tyler, the book of Daniel. He was able to see the Aramaic and read it and recognize. We hear all these other stories, they didn't know what it was. He knew what it was when he saw that. These are early copies of the Bible. Now, they didn't understand how early and all of that. And so the question immediately became, who so laboriously copied these scrolls and put them into the caves? What happened, the Zealots, had come down, and not the Zealots, the Essenes were living here. And when the Zealots had started the war with the Romans, they came down, and the Essenes had to leave because the Romans were coming down. They fled to Masada, and they put all these scrolls into the caves and left them there. The Essenes had copied these. They were a very, very strict sect of the Jews at the time of Jesus and John the Baptist, and then at this time. Now, in 1951, DeVoe and Harding began to dig here at a place called Khirbet Qumran. And as you can see the Dead Sea there, and you can see Jordan over on the other side. And as they began to dig, they found pottery that matched the pottery in the caves. And so they had a connection here. So that's why we believe this is the Essenes. And then they found this room here, and it turns out to be a scriptorium where they would very carefully copy the scriptures. It was a scribe's room. And they had tables that were not dining room tables. These were actually tables for copying the manuscripts. And they copied these manuscripts, and then they put them in when the Romans were coming and fled to Masada, where they lost their lives. So here we ask the question, what's the significance of this? Well, they found the entire book of Isaiah. They found sections of every book of the Hebrew Scriptures with the exception of Esther, because it doesn't mention the name of God. Miller Burroughs was the president of the American School of Oriental Research. He announced the discovery to the world, and he later wrote a book on this. This is what he says in his book. Some readers may be disappointed that the translations of the Isaiah manuscript are not included in this edition of the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fact is that most of the differences between these manuscripts and the traditional Hebrew text do not involve changes of meaning that would be evident in a translation. And the differences that do involve such changes are not sufficiently frequent to justify the space for the translations of these texts. So what was the question that the guy asked? How many? It's a disquieting thought when we think about 1,000 years and how many changes how many would you know? Well, Miller Burrows said you wouldn't even see any in an English translation. That's how many there were. Can you believe that? 1,000 years separating the two sources of manuscripts. Over 1,000 years. And you wouldn't even notice it in an English translation. So, fabulous tales the tale tells. We've looked tonight from Petra all the way over to Iraq, from Iraq all the way over to Turkey, from Turkey down to the Dead Sea. And over again, the spade confirms the book. The spade confirms the book. God has preserved His Word in the Bible, and we can have confidence in it. It reminds me of what Isaiah 40 verse 8 says, "The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever." Which is quite similar to this beautiful poem by John Greenleaf Whittier. We search the world for truth. We call the good, the pure, the beautiful, from graven stone and written scroll and all the old flower fields of the soul. And weary seeker of the best, we come back laden from our quest to find that all the sages said is in the book our mothers read. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for the opportunity tonight to share these stories that warm my heart with this group of people, and I pray that it will warm their hearts also, that we can see that we can have confidence in the book, we have confidence in the Bible, and that it's a true book, and we thank you for all these evidences that have come to light in our time to give us confidence in a skeptical time. And I pray that you will help each of us to hear your voice as we read that book. May we hear your voice. May it speak to our hearts. May it renew our hearts each and every day is my prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, let me tell you where we're going tomorrow night. We're going to the city of Jerusalem. This is not the Jewish temple. This is the Dome of the Rock. It's actually a Muslim shrine. And we'll talk about that. Muhammad, they say, went to heaven from here in a ladder of light on his trusted steed, El Barak. And then on Wednesday evening, we'll talk about the footsteps of Jesus. Thursday evening, when Iraq ruled the world. And so we got some really special things coming along. And there's going to continue. It's going to continue after that.
You need to talk for me because I've lost my microphone.
Oh, yes. Okay. Let me stand on this side and you can talk this way.
Can I talk? Yeah, you could hear me that way.
Yeah.
That was work. We'd just be very friendly. Is it down there? Other side of the table? Yeah. All right. Well,
Don't
need you anymore. We can still stand close. We still like you.
All right.
I hope you guys have been enjoying, but we do have a gift to give away, and let me open this a little bit just to show you. So this is, and then you can give us a little bit of information so everybody can hear. So this one, what did you tell me about that one?
It looks like to me an early Christian lamp. It kind of got sign of a fish on it, some of the like fish bones and so on. So probably more 4th, 5th century AD.
All right.
Very nice shape, a little handle on the back.
Yeah, it's very nice. All right, so we need to pick. So you want me to pick it this time? Sure. Okay.
He's got some gum under it, I bet. You got to check it, Ryan, and see.
All right, it's clean. We have 0486493. Back there? There we go. All right.
Beautiful.
Sure enough. All right, so we do have the handouts back on the table there at the back for tonight. If you didn't pick up your handout from last night, that is also out in the lobby as you come in. And then we'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow night for the Jew, the Arab, and Jerusalem. So, anything else?
The Jew, the Christian, the Muslim, and Jerusalem.
I just read what was
I
up
know,
there.
I know. Because many Christians are actually Arab as well,
Correct.
in that part of the world.
All right, have a wonderful night. And feel free to come up and look and talk. You notice our lamp is still burning, so burning bright.